Okay, everyone, welcome to the CHIWORK online series, a weekly conversation on HCI and the future of work. I'm Navina, a postdoc at Harvard University. I'm one of the technical program chairs who host these conversations, along with Max, Aaron, Toby, and Shadan. Thank you to the general chairs, Andrew and Orit, for bringing us together, and to the student volunteers who make this series happen every week, Alberta, Isabel, and Nabil. As usual, we're recording the first half of the Q&A, and we welcome additional questions from the audience. So feel free to put them in the chat at any time, and we'll be sure to get to them. Then we'll stop the recording for the second half and open up the floor for more questions and discussion. Now I'd like to welcome our amazing guest, Palashi Vaghela. Palashi is a PhD candidate in information science at Cornell University. Her research interests lie at the intersection of science and technology studies, feminist studies, sociocultural anthropology, and information sciences. And her dissertation is an ethnography of gender and caste in the Indian computing industry. Her research has been supported by the Social Science Research Council, Mellon Foundation, and Microsoft Research, and multiple other institutions. So thank you. We're so excited you could join us today.
The pleasure is all mine. I'm so excited to meet everybody in this group that I've been kind of following, but only becoming a part of now. So thank you for having me.
Wonderful. So to start off, your work kind of looks at caste from different angles and different arenas. And so I'm wondering if you can start by telling us about your work on caste and Twitter and what inspired this work.
Yeah, like many collaborations, I think it began with me wanting to work on a caste within social media and how that might manifest. And having the chance to work with Jajit, who was working on social media and politics at that time. So we kind of found an intersection of wanting to study similar things. And what I was really interested in thinking about is that, for example, in politics in India, we do have representation of different castes within the parliament. And so I was interested in thinking about when we do have certain locations of caste available, can we make sense of what kind of interactions does that kind of manifest into, and what role does caste play in it online? So so that was one motivation. And the second motivation was I had been reading about how networks and like social networks in particular in sociology and anthropology of caste have manifested thinking about how caste might operate at the village level. And I was curious about whether we could apply or think about caste networks on Twitter to understand how those interactions again like manifest into caste capital, as networks can sometimes manifest into social capital. And lastly, the motivation was to dispel this idea of castelessness of upper castes, where the marking of lower caste people has been kind of codified in the constitution through reservations, which is important. But at the same time, it kind of generated this idea that caste is something that lower caste people have to deal with, but upper caste people are unmarked or kind of can operate without having to kind of identify with their caste location. So there were multiple kind of reasons for wanting to pursue it. And one of the just fortuitous things that happened was that politics on Twitter was also becoming really important to kind of think about, because a lot of politicians started interacting with each other and with their audiences and their voters online. So we just thought that it would be a good way to kind of start something that like at least before that wasn't being, in my understanding, hadn't been explored explicitly in online communication.
And I'm curious what the findings were around this, especially, you know, if voters are interacting with politicians, like what does that end up, how does that impact people given these networks? So
this is opening up like a whole Pandora box of like, I'm going to jump into some of the challenges we faced while doing this. And I know that's one of the questions also, but the reason I'm going to the challenges is that we wanted to study actually how caste might appear in the kind of tweets that politicians put out. And one of the things that we found really hard to do was that caste was mostly operating covertly. and not overtly. So there wasn't obvious trends we could see in the Twitter content. And so we started thinking about if we could study interactions between politicians and how they retweet each other and how they might be deciding to befriend each other, or like follow each other on Twitter. And the reason, I mean, there are multiple reasons, because one was the time factor. It took a really long time for us to get the data on politicians, which went beyond the usual suspects of marking of upper castes as a huge category of general category, and then lower castes as scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and other backward castes. Now, the problem with that was we wanted to actually demystify the general category, and we didn't have that data at hand. So we wanted to, we got, it almost took us 6 months to get that data. So that was one of the challenges. And what that also meant was that once we did have the data, we weren't able to see content trends. So we started thinking about how do we, within the time that I had at Microsoft Research, how do I make sure that we are able to do something with this data without kind of, without having to make it a project that lasts like years, which I do think it can be a project that can be done over multiple years. But to come back to the question you were asking, is that we were actually very interested in understanding how content and then voter interaction, or like public interaction with these tweets, might tell us something about caste, but that's not something we were able to do in that time period. So hopefully sometime in the future, somebody else does it, or I'm able to do it. But what we ended up finding was that we saw trends of caste playing a role in how politicians, especially the members of parliament, were tweeting each other. So upper caste members of parliament tended to retweet other upper caste members. And in terms of the recent paper that we just published at CSCW, which is being presented this week, we found that it also manifested in what kind of structural properties the network showed, in terms of what kind of centrality and other kind of structural properties of different members of different castes gave them what kind of social capital in that network. So like one example of that is that we saw that upper caste members of BJP, which is the ruling party of India at this point, were able to not only have important locations in the network and garner social capital from that, but also had the benefit of being followed by more lower caste people, whereas the lower caste members of the BJP and also other parties weren't getting the same kind of social capital. They were not only not being followed by multiple groups of castes of members of parliament, but they were also not occupying influential positions in the network. So this is, I think, at least our attempt with the kind of data we had. Again, like we couldn't do the kind of statistical analysis we wanted to at especially the kind of level that with the data we had, because the members of parliament are only 480 members. And the problem with that is that we weren't able to kind of scale some of the analysis as we would have been able to if we had a bigger data set. Now, we had a bigger data set of politicians, but we didn't have their caste locations. So trying to put all of these factors together to produce some sort of study to start understanding how caste might operate on Twitter was one of the first steps we just wanted to take to begin with. But there's so much more work that needs to happen, and hopefully will happen in the future. I don't know if that answers the question a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this challenge you mentioned about figuring out like what are the markers that allow you to, determine caste location. Can you say a bit more about, what it is? Was it about the tweet or the profile data or?
Yeah, we had a chance to actually we got lucky. That's probably what it is. We got lucky because the Trivedi's Center for Political Studies in New Delhi, which is located within the Ashoka University, was doing work on the ground to collect caste locations specifically of general caste members, general category members on the ground. So these annotations were really solid because, as you know, or some people here may or may not know, last names and other categories can be kind of markers of caste, but you can never be entirely sure if that is actually accurate, right? Like sometimes you know that this person is a Brahmin, sometimes you may not. Or this person is from a particular caste, or sometimes you may not. And the reason for that is a lot of people change their last names to gain socioeconomic mobility in a caste society. So one of the reasons that we were also feeling hesitant to work with just retweet or like just Twitter content data was that these markers were not, we couldn't trust them to be accurately mapped onto some people's caste, because unless we know whether they come from certain caste and communities, we couldn't be sure what their location was and where they were coming from. And the second part of it was that I think the way that politics in India right now has developed is that there are hard caste lines that play a role in how voter politics is mobilized, like who votes for whom, because there is a reservation of particular seats for particular castes. But at the same time, on a public platform, most upper caste kind of members would tend to eschew caste in how they would engage with publics. So there's a kind of a tension. So like publicly, they appear to be secular, but at the same time on the ground, when they're interacting with their kind of voter base, there's a clear marking of this caste will vote for this member because of particular reasons, etc. So there is this tension there. And so what the other challenge we had was that the content was quite hard to decipher from the perspective of how do you interpret markers, because mostly people were trying to stay away from that or tiptoe around it in the public discourse. So that's one part of it. And I'm sorry, I forgot the question. I'm sorry, I just kind of diverted in direction. But yeah, I think, sorry, I just came back to, so the reason we had this data of like what member of parliament is from what caste is that we actually got lucky with our collaboration with Trivedi Political Center, and they were able to give us locally verified information about caste locations of the groups that we were interested in kind of exploring dynamics of. Yeah.
I see. Very interesting.
But that took us 6 months to find, because we were just like, how do we do this? Like, we could we tried mapping it on our own a little bit, but there could, I think one of the things that Trivedi Center is doing just phenomenal is going to the local constituencies of each of these members of parliament and figuring out from the local knowledge of the people what caste they are, right? Because it's not declared on the election or the kind of ticket that you get as a member, because you just have to mention the fact that you're from a general category or a reserved category, but you don't get to know whether this particular person within the general category, what caste location they come from.
And I guess that really speaks to the importance of understanding this, if it's being reflected on the ground and then also within your study. So at this point, I'm curious about your subsequent line of work that was more looking at caste in tech work. Can you tell us about the study?
Yeah, so that work has been ongoing for a while, and that's part of the dissertation project that I'm doing. And the work kind of emerged from me landing in India to do field work during a pandemic, where I was really constrained to think about how do I do this field work without having access to the spaces that I thought I would have access to. And interestingly, what ended up happening was I was obviously interested in the question of caste, but my initial plan was to work with upper castes only to understand how upper castes within the computing industry and how caste kind of operates among them. But this particular study emerged from kind of having those restrictions of me not being able to build networks at the rate at which I would be able to. So I shifted focus to thinking about how are people who are marked particularly by caste within the computing industry. That is, in this case, I focus on Dalits. So Dalits are a group of people who are who used to be considered untouchable as part of the caste system once upon a time. And they are kind of a protected category in India, and there is a law against untouchability. But there is like thousands of years of caste discrimination and kind of systemic disadvantages that they navigate. And I wanted to understand how Dalit engineers in the IT industry or in the computing industry end up experiencing caste, or if they do at all, right? Like how does that manifest and what do they do with it? What was going to be like a preliminary study became like one of the major parts of my dissertation. And that's what kind of is the cornerstone of my dissertation. And that Kai paper kind of explores how Dalit engineers learn to interpret how caste is being talked about, because it's not very straightforward sometimes. Like people are not directly asking you what caste you're from, but it's more codified. and it is nuanced and subtle. So as a Dalit person who's marked in particular ways, who might be disadvantaged in these communities, you have to learn to kind of pick up cues on what is, or like how is caste being talked about, when is it being talked about, etc. And then once my study kind of found out that once people learned how to interpret caste, the next step was how do you kind of subvert your caste location so that you are not necessarily marked in a way. So it is similar to the idea of passing in some ways. And the reason some people would need to do that is that there is this idea that is quite, I would say it's quite mainstream within the computing or IT industry and broadly within India also, is that reservations and meritocracy are at odds with each other. So this is similar to kind of the debates within US, where affirmative action is assumed to be kind of challenging meritocracy in certain spaces. And so one of the reasons Dalit engineers or other lower caste people tend to want to hide their caste or pass as upper caste is to not have their merit or their kind of ability to work in the industry be questioned. So the work kind of finds two different sets of challenges, two different sets of tactics, and actually thinks about caste legibility as a sort of a performance where lower caste people are also not only subverting legibility of caste by like obfuscating what caste they're from, trying to, not answer questions, trying to change the topic, trying to kind of stay away from certain discussions. But also the other part was like when it got too much, certain people were also interrupting this idea of the fact that, oh, if you're coming from a reserved category or coming from a lower caste category, you must be unmeritorious. You're here, your claim to being in computing is coming from the fact that you got reservations and you got this seat because of the fact that you are from that caste and you don't deserve to be here. So we saw both of these trends happening in kind of the stories that the Dalit engineers told us about their experiences. And lastly, we found, just like any other marginalized community, they needed to find other Dalit engineers sometimes. And sometimes they were able to, and sometimes they wouldn't, because it was such a fraught territory of how do you go about finding your own people when you're actually trying to obfuscate your own location from some people. So there are people who spoke about feeling extremely lonely and only getting lonelier as they feeling lonelier as they climb up the corporate or the IT industry ladder. And then there were others who had managed to find other people through tactics and markers that only Dalits could understand in some ways, right? And they trusted that upper castes are probably not knowing that these markers are very obviously what marks a Dalit person from the other. So this is broadly what the study is about. And we kind of argue that lower caste and in general, marginalized communities are subverting and negotiating their place with structures of hierarchy and power and inequality in the workplace on a daily basis. And that if we look at identities as being performative, as we see in the case of caste, we're able to give them more agency for how they operate within structures of hegemony or other kinds of hierarchy that may lead to more marginalization of these communities.
So I know you've also done consulting work in this space, like in terms of caste in the workplace, and there's also clearly an increasing movement, especially so in the U.S. in academia and industry around raising awareness of caste and incorporating it as a protected category, and caste also travels across borders. And so I'm curious, how does your research speak to, DEI efforts in computing, given, especially how increasingly transnational the computing industry is?
So there's so many things I want to say to that. I'm just going to limit my answer to a couple of things. But one of the things that also happened while we were in a pandemic was this kind of Cisco lawsuit that brought a lot of attention to caste, which I think was long due. But at the same time, I think there's been a lot of pushback against bringing up caste as a protected category. And I don't know if folks here are aware, but recently a caste-related talk was canceled at Google because people within Google were feeling concerned about how this might end up dividing people, or kind of feeling like this is going to lead to more trouble. And so I think that there is something really interesting happening, both in the case of the fact that these issues are emerging from the US, and then what kind of pull it's having in the transnational relationship of caste. Within my own research, what I've tried to do is I've tried to locate in my interviews with people, especially in India. I'm interviewing people in diasporic communities also, but in my interviews with people in India, there is some sort of awareness around the fact that this is happening in the US, but it seems like there isn't like, oh, this is happening there. That's kind of the kind of relationship that I'm seeing, at least. And this is again not representative of maybe like what leadership might be talking about. And we do see some sort of like movement happening. But frankly speaking, I've been speaking to coming back to the conversation around DEI, my other part of the work in the dissertation is engaging with diversity and inclusion efforts, and specifically looking at women in technology efforts in India, and specifically in Bangalore and Chennai, to understand how women in technology efforts are either engaging with caste or not engaging with caste, and how the category of women in technology is kind of established through relations of gender, and what role intersectionality plays or doesn't play in it. So that's one part of it. And the reason I bring that up is that as part of that conversation with the women in tech that I've been speaking to, there is this awareness that something like this is happening in some people that I spoke with, but not everybody. So that's one. And some of the people who are aware, it's the people who are more at mid or senior level positions who are probably being pulled into these conversations because they're still being deliberated at the organizational level, and haven't been implemented in policy yet. So that's one observation. And the second observation that I would make is that there is, but the people who I did speak with who had awareness of this happening, they were not feeling like this is something they have to deal with. It felt like, that's something that's happening there. And then, yeah, maybe they're thinking about it, but we haven't been asked to think about it because we haven't seen any cases of caste discrimination, or we haven't heard of it yet. So that's really interesting, because the kind of boundary setting of like, this is not our problem, this is a problem that's happening elsewhere, is fascinating if you come to think about it. At the same time, there is no denying of the fact that because it is happening in the Silicon Valley, some of these cases are emerging in Silicon Valley, it has entered some of the common parlance, which it didn't even exist before in India. So that's one part of it. And the second thing I would say about the diversity and inclusion things is that there is this sense of anxiety around talking about caste, even within the US, right? So the members that are bringing up, members of the activist or advocacy communities that are bringing these things up, are being actively vilified by not only tech workers, but people who feel anxious about talking about caste in the first place. Just talking about it we don't even reach the conversation of casteism. There's this movement of not wanting to talk about it at all. So my and so it's interesting that these recently IBM and Apple both added caste as a protected category, and I think there is more work needed, and I hope to be able to do it in the future, to understand how are these forces of like what there's active anti-caste work happening in terms of not only recognizing that caste is an issue, but also trying to resolve it. And then there's this pushback from the communities that are trying to say that caste actually isn't an issue, and that we shouldn't be talking about this because this will just divide us further. And I think there's something really interesting to be looked at here. I am not looking at it right now for my dissertation, but that's the plan for the future work. I think understanding what role, what role like anti-caste movement within the computing industry is playing at a global and a transnational level, but also in terms of what does it do to the political economy of computing as we understand it, because we know that workers in different parts of the world who work for the industry are precariously placed, and we're still trying to understand how. We know how race and gender might be playing a role in that, but we're still trying to understand what role caste is playing with it. And simultaneously knowing that whether US US pushback is doing anything for lower caste members in India, that's something that needs to be studied. I haven't, I don't think I'll be able to do it for my dissertation, but hopefully in the future.
Yeah, these all sound like really, really important directions. And absolutely. I think there is one question from Max, if you wanted to share.
I'll read it out so that I am also able to process it. Yeah. Does the explicit nature, or Max, do you want to ask it directly?
Sure, yeah. I was so forgive me because I don't know very much about caste, so my question probably comes across as naive. But it seems to me that maybe the explicit nature of the caste system is helping us define things that are happening in other places around the world that don't have the explicit defined caste structure, to see that actually the same patterns are occurring between different, levels of authority or society that are there, but don't have the explicit label. So is this helping you to interpret the different privileges that groups are having in other parts of the world, even though they don't have the explicit label?
Oh, that's a great question. Funnily enough, I'm just coming out of teaching a class where, I was a little bit frazzled because of that, but we were reading Max de Boiron's recent work that talks about practicing an anti-colonial pollution science. And what she does, interestingly, in that book is use this category of marked and unmarked for people who have decided to mark themselves as being settler or being from a particular race, as whatever they mark themselves as. And if they haven't marked themselves, all the scholars who haven't marked themselves explicitly in any form, she uses a bracketed term of unmarked next to their name every time she's citing them and writing about them. And what is interesting to me in that, and the reason I bring this up, is that this kind of a parallel would not work for caste, because not everybody wants to be marked as being lower caste, right? And so what this does is it also changes our understanding of how do we make sense of power and inequality if we are also thinking about markers that are not visible, and how do we kind of make sense of markers that may or may not be easy to kind of codify in like a blanketed term of like, I am a settler, and those are not binaries itself. We also know that. But what my point is that this changes kind of our understanding that there are these particular ways of performing or being part of anti-colonial movements in science and tech, that we can do due justice to if we try to do good practices of like, I am declaring my location. But sometimes declaring your location is actually not ideal, and some people might not want to do that. And that is what I think Caste shows in the work that we did in CHI. And I'm thinking, and as part of the dissertation, I'm also thinking about what does this mean for when we think about caste as becoming data. And that's my future work, is thinking about when the question of caste becoming data is kind of raised, like the question of legibility is like two-sided. It's not legibility. So there is this work that I'm doing with Twitter where I want to use legibility to question the fact that the unmarked category of general castes is actually placing the burden of being marked by caste on lower castes. But simultaneously, this kind of legibility, which I'm pushing for, can be dangerous for lower caste people because they might not want to be marked. So these are, what I'm trying to say is that I think understanding caste can nuance our sense of what are good practices and what is the way to kind of decolonize or kind of move away from racist or building anti-racist and anti-caste worlds of computing. And hopefully I will bring that in conversation with my next paper, because that's what I'm working on. But that's a great question. All I want to say is that I'm thinking about it and I will be writing about it. I don't have an obvious answer to it so far, but yeah, those are the things I'm thinking about with that question. Yeah.
I think it's very interesting, and I'm trying to think of examples I know locally within the UK, where sometimes you can see that people are kind of hiding their normal nature of how they would dress, or how they would have some tattoos which they cover up or try to hide in order to fit into a workplace expected culture. And I feel like there's unlabeled groups or names for people, in different natural kind of societal groups, which don't have a label here, but people try to hide some of them in order to fit for the type of job they want, until it becomes normal that people can have that type of job in different social groups. So it's just really interesting that it's all unlabeled here. And then in this particular example, it's almost possible to label it, even if we don't necessarily want to.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, these are questions that I think we need to be thinking about to not ghettoize caste. So that's another thing that I think I'm worried about, is that there is this, like, caste is not, I mean, I don't want, or at least people who are working on caste are as doing this, and this is probably something, attention that other people might be facing also with the work that they're doing, is how do you maintain the specificity of the fact that caste is based in a hierarchical system that emerges from religious and social relationships located within South Asia because of its particular history, but at the same time have lessons for building solidarities with other groups that are marginalized. And that is just a fine line that one has to balance. But I think it's important to stay within that tension and not try to go in either of these directions, which can, I think, which ends up kind of harming the discourse more than it kind of ends up helping different groups that are trying to engage with different locations and powers in these spaces. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
And then we have a question from Andrew.
Andrew, do you want to ask it directly?
Sure. No, this is really interesting. I think I'm following up on Max's question, but this is a naive question, so please tell me if I'm totally on the wrong track here. But it appears to me that just the number of castes is relatively large, right? If I understand it, it's many, like hundreds or thousands, right? In contrast to, let's say, races or religions that might be co-present in a particular area. And I'm not sure, but is this sort of one of those things that is quite different and perhaps makes it more difficult to apply lessons learned from one region to another? For example, it's quite common for people who have Jewish ancestry to not even know about the fact that they have Jewish ancestry and only find out from some DNA test, because their parents or grandparents would actively, they moved away from that, they changed their last names and never told anybody because they were so worried about anybody finding out that was just, Madeleine Albright, former Secretary of State, is one example. She found out in her 70s or 80s, right? But then again, there's the Jewish religion and then, let's say, Christian religions in some area, right? So it's sort of like two, perhaps, maybe, or three or four. And I'm just curious, is that a big contrast where you have so many different castes, or is that more like what you're saying, marked, unmarked, or maybe you can sort of reduce that variability?
No, that's an excellent comparison. I think I would say that the way we use word, I mean, this really goes into the nitty-gritty, which I love. I think it's really important to discuss it, but the language of caste is not very obvious when you translate it into the local understanding of what you're terming as hundreds or thousands of castes, which is what is understood as jati, so which is at the subcaste level. And then there's one more caste level, which is the attributed kind of like a macro caste level, I would say, which is what the hierarchy ascribes to. And within the Kai paper also, we talk about how some of these things are really localized, right? Like, so maybe a caste that is dominant in a particular region and comes from that region might not be a dominant caste in another region, right? And so there are more complexities for sure that makes it difficult for people to understand how do we make sense of caste in the world. But the other thing that you raised, which was really interesting to me, is that the question of cultural forms of caste, which is, there's this brilliant book by Balmurli Natarajan, which basically talks about how in the diasporic communities specifically, caste has become culturalized, where certain cultural practices are more associated with the caste that they come from and may or may not map on to people thinking that they are caste practices, right? So for example, the thread ceremony, which a lot of Brahmins have in their communities, was basically like they're adorned with a sacred thread as part of being in kind of brought into the Brahmin fold. That is definitely a caste marker. But a lot of people see it as a cultural process, especially when you think about it in diasporic communities, where the preservation of culture in diaspora becomes really important to be able to maintain an identity different from the place that they've migrated to, right? And in these cases, I think there's some similar sort of an amnesia, maybe not, I don't know how much of it is intentional or how much of, and probably intention is irrelevant here, but more structural in the sense of the fact that there will be people who will continue to invoke senses of being Brahmin or being from a certain community and having these practices. At the same time, they will believe that the computing workplace or the workplace that they go to is casteless. And so these kind of disparities exist together. Like there is this contradiction that exists together in the computing workplace, where people think that these are like our cultural practices. And, just because I'm Brahmin at home doesn't mean I'm Brahmin at work, kind of a thing. And that's the space that needs to be troubled a little bit more, because at least in the interviews that we did with the Dalit engineers, and also in my work that I'm doing with women in tech, these identities that are outside, that are thought of as being outside of the workplace, are actually shaping relations at the workplace. But we just don't think that they are, right? So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's a great provocation that I'll keep thinking about more, actually. But this is the parallel that I could think of in some ways.
Thanks.
Thank you. Great. Thank you again, Palashi, for the conversation so far. So before we end the recording, I just wanted to note we'll be taking a break next week for the Thanksgiving holidays in the United States, but please join us on December 1st for Aaron's conversation with Eunice Tolil, assistant professor at Worcester Polytechnic Institute. We hope to see you all there. Great. Thank you.